So welcome back to HipMojo. Right before we took a break, you asked me for some examples of cases where the CEO maybe didn't act so morally correct and basically blamed his VC and the board. Not saying that this was the case, but take Airbnb.
Right.
So are you familiar with Airbnb?
Yeah, absolutely.
It is?
It is the site where you can pretty much go and lease properties online to complete strangers. And recently they had a problem with someone who let out her apartment, came home, found it completely trashed, vandalized.
They turned her place into a toilet, basically. So I've used Airbnb, and I think the first time I came across it, I was like, genius idea. Now, the thing that's tricky is, one time I realized that I was basically subleasing from someone who themselves was subleasing. So the owner found out and basically told me it's not legal. She didn't threaten to kick us out, but between being there with a wife and a young daughter, I did sort of hesitate to use it in the future, but I still think it's a good service. Now, getting back to the story is this. When the story first broke out, Airbnb didn't comment on it publicly. A month later, basically the victim, the alleged victim, came out and basically more or less blasted Airbnb, and then Airbnb sort of went out and wrote a blog post, and it was a lot of back and forth, and even the VCs came out, great guy, the guy behind Y Combinator, but a lot of people thought, well, he was being disingenuous because, he's got his investment there. So do you think that that happens? Like if you work at a company and the boss has outside investors, do you find that it's easier to just blame the investors and say, hey, sorry, I got to lay off 20% of the staff. The VC made you do it.
Well, I think in the moment, I think it's easier to blame investors internally where it's not going to get back to them. I think it's difficult to blame them publicly because if you're that worried about them that you're making bad decisions just to keep them happy, why would you publicly piss them off? Can you imagine why anyone might do that?
No, I don't know. I just think it's more that if you don't have that outside, requirements that a VC has, you can't walk in and tell your employees or your clients something like, let's say, oh, we got to charge more. The client's like, well, you're making this decision. If you lay someone off, you can't just blame, an outside force. Okay.
Well, have you ever taken venture capital from anyone?
No, partly because they make you do things that you don't think are in the best interest of the company for like the short period and the long term as well. That's the main reason. It's just because.
So you think as far as startups go, at least for the first few years, whether they can get money or not, they should really focus on developing their product or their service rather than.
No, not necessarily. I think that's another argument. I think it's if you're going to find investors that know the industry and who are reasonable people, then you should do business with them because they'll help you. The problem is, oftentimes, I don't think VCs make investments in companies based on where they want to invest. They make investments based on which entrepreneur is going to give me what I want. So in that sense, it's almost like, it's a recipe doomed for failure, so to speak. We have to shift gears and move on to lightning round, but staying on the Airbnb topic. Question 1.
Right.
In 5 years, A, Craigslist will have crushed Airbnb, or B, Airbnb will have crushed Craigslist?
Social media douchebag response, co-optition. I think Airbnb may or may not be around. If it continues to, it will eat slightly into Craigslist's market share as far as property leasing goes, but let's face it, use Craigslist for a lot of other things like sex and secondhand furniture.
It's good to know. Question 2, if you start a company tomorrow, do you raise capital or do you bootstrap?
I'd bootstrap at least for the first year or two. And then see how things were going and how badly I needed money. And like you said, which VCs would be willing to give me something that I wanted so I wouldn't have to hand over complete control.
We're not talking about sex anymore, I hope. Just checking. Okay, question 3. This week on WatchMojo. Yeah, this week on WatchMojo, we published a couple of profiles on Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg. Learned a lot, I must say. Now, my question to you is, if you had to be one of those two guys for a week, which one would you pick, Mark Zuckerberg or Steve Jobs?
I think I would pick Mark Zuckerberg. One, as powerful and everything as Steve Jobs is, I'm sure Mark Zuckerberg gets laid a lot more. More importantly, I think the company probably has a lot of ties into the intelligence community, kind of like Google might, and I'd love a first-hand glimpse at what they got going on.
That was pretty random, but okay, so good stuff. If you have any questions, that was the first show. Feel free to email us your feedback, your comments, your suggestions at live@WatchMojo.com. Thanks, CT.
Thanks, Ash.